A youthful mother and her 6-month-old infant disappeared from Everglades National Park, setting off a desperate search effort. When the teams came up empty, investigators were forced into the somber conclusion that they had been taken by the swamp's top predators. The case went cold for a year, an official file with no final resolution. That resolution was finally added when hunters apprehended a python with a stomach so grotesquely bloated it strained credulity. And the reality it held was more terrifying than any alligator assault. The asphalt of the parking area near the Everglades National Park entrance still gave off the day's accumulated heat, even as the Florida sun descended below the sawgrass horizon. It was Saturday, the 14th of June, 2014. Ara Connolly rested against the hood of her vehicle, the metal still warm under her hands. The atmosphere, thick and moist, pulsed with the growing symphony of cicadas and the far-off guttural roars of alligators starting their nightly rituals. She glanced at her phone once more. 8:15 p.m. The screen's light cast a glow on her face, accentuating the deepening worry lines around her eyes. Her daughter, 28-year-old Roisin Callan, and her grandson Tieran, only 6 months old, were supposed to have been here to meet her more than an hour ago. The vast parking space, which had been alive with tourists, families, and airboat captains just hours before, was now nearly deserted. A couple of park ranger trucks were stationed close to the entrance, but otherwise, Ara was by herself. She tried Roisin's number for the 6th time in 30 minutes. It went directly to voicemail. A chilling knot of dread tightened in her gut, separate from the oppressive humidity that clung to her skin. Roisin was dependable. She was methodical, meticulous with her plans, particularly where Tieran was involved. She wouldn't just forget a pickup time or allow her phone to die without a heads up. Ara swiped through her photos, her thumb pausing on a picture she'd captured that very morning. It felt like an entirely different lifetime. Roisin had looked so alive, standing right beside the massive gray rock that held the official Everglades National Park sign. She had on a vibrant yellow sundress adorned with green flowers, and a wide-brimmed straw hat shielded her pale skin from the intense sun. Dark sunglasses hid her eyes, but her smile was broad and authentic. Strapped firmly to her chest in a soft, grayish-blue fabric carrier was Tieran, who was flashing a huge, toothless smile at his grandmother. It was the image of a flawless day trip. Now, as the last hints of twilight vanished, and the advancing darkness seemed to magnify the untamed noises of the swamp, the photo felt eerie. Ara pushed away from the car and strode swiftly to the ranger station, the gravel crunching beneath her shoes. Inside, the air conditioning offered a stark relief from the heavy heat outside. She located a park ranger, Officer Davies, who was completing the day's reports. Ara laid out the circumstances, her voice shaking slightly as she recounted the information. Roisin, 28, Tieran, 6 months. They were meant to be hiking the easy trails, nothing demanding. They had intended to be there for the whole day, a much-needed break from the strains of Roisin's life. As the ranger started making the required calls, the details of Roisin's life came into sharper view. She was a widow. Her husband had passed away without warning less than a year before, leaving Roisin to handle the challenges of new motherhood alone and in a precarious financial state. The life insurance payment had been small, compelling Roisin to return to part-time nursing work sooner than she had hoped. She was worn out, balancing the demands of the hospital with the sleepless nights of a baby, but she was fiercely self-reliant. She seldom took financial aid from Ara, resolved to support Tieran on her own. This outing to the Everglades was intended as a reset, a moment to breathe after a grueling week. Ara had dropped them off at 10 a.m. Roisin had been insistent on exploring by herself. She desired the quiet time with her son. They had brought plenty of provisions: water, snacks, diapers, and a small first aid kit. Roisin had a healthy respect for the wilderness. She wasn't one to take foolish risks. Officer Davis's attitude changed from courteous concern to focused professionalism. The Everglades was not just a park. It was a huge, unforgiving wilderness covering 1.5 million acres of wetlands. The risks were many: dehydration, getting lost, alligators, poisonous snakes. A single woman with a baby was extremely vulnerable. By 10 p.m., the entrance was lit up by the flashing lights of the local police. An official report for a missing person was submitted. As the suffocating darkness of the Florida night enveloped the swamp, the search for Roisin and Tyran Kalin commenced. The sense of urgency was strong. Every hour that went by lowered the probability of a good outcome. The wilderness that had held the promise of a peaceful day now concealed a terrifying unknown. Dawn arrived over the Everglades on Sunday morning. The rising sun sliced through the thick, humid air, signaling another day of punishing heat. The search effort, which had been organized overnight, was immense in its scope. The disappearance of a mother and baby prompted a response from multiple agencies, which turned the park entrance into a busy, well-ordered command post. Local police, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, FWC, and National Park Service rangers worked together. The air buzzed with the sounds of radio traffic, the thunder of airboat engines, and the steady beat of helicopter rotors. The initial plan was simple: concentrate on the places Roisin would have most likely gone. Ara Connolly, looking pale and having had no sleep, gave investigators Roisin's planned path. She had intended to stay on the well-kept boardwalk trails near the main entrance. These were popular spots, with heavy foot traffic from tourists. It felt impossible that a person could disappear from there without anyone noticing, without leaving behind any clue. Airboats were sent out to survey the waterways in the expansive fields of sawgrass, their huge fans roaring as they glided over the shallow water. Helicopters with thermal imaging technology flew in low patterns over the thick groves of trees. Their sensors looked for any indication of a human presence under the foliage. On the ground, groups of rangers, police officers, and seasoned volunteers started to walk the trails, calling out Roisin's name, their voices absorbed by the vastness of the landscape. The K-9 units that were brought in to follow Roisin's scent from the parking lot had trouble with the overwhelming sensory information of the swamp and the large number of people who had been in the area over the weekend. While the physical search intensified, detectives started the standard background check on Roisin Kalin's life. They had to figure out who she was, and if there was any hidden reason she might have decided to vanish, or if someone might have had a reason to hurt her. The image that formed was one of quiet strength and heartbreaking normalcy. Roisin was a devoted mother, well-liked by her co-workers at the hospital. Her financial difficulties were clear from her bank records. The stress of getting by on a single part-time salary was obvious, but she was coping. There were no indications of depression, no secret affairs, no major debts to dangerous people, no enemies. She was just a young widow attempting to create a life for her son. The technical side of the investigation provided little more than a confirmation of the timeline. Roisin's cell phone records were obtained. Her phone had last connected to a tower near the park entrance soon after she was dropped off on Saturday morning. After that, the digital footprint disappeared. This indicated that the phone was either switched off, broken, or had gone out of range deep inside the park very early in the day. The first 48 hours were crucial, and the search parties pushed themselves to their breaking point. They discovered the usual tourist litter: stray water bottles, discarded wrappers, even a lost child's shoe, but nothing that belonged to Roisin or Tyrion. The heat was unforgiving, the humidity suffocating. The searchers fought against dehydration and tiredness, motivated by the pressing need to find the missing mother and baby. It was on the third day of the search, Tuesday, June 17th, that the operation hit an unforeseen and major roadblock, one that would drastically change the direction of the immediate search. The command center was getting ready to broaden the search area to include the less frequented, rougher trails and service roads that spread out deeper into the park. These were places Roisin was less likely to have visited, but since the main trails had produced nothing, they had to be checked. It was the logical next move in a thorough search strategy. Detective Jasper Mallory, a veteran officer acting as the local police contact for the interagency effort, came to the command meeting with urgent information. Mallory was known for his practical, sometimes by-the-book style of policing. He spoke to the search coordinators with a serious and concerned tone. He told them that a large part of the planned expansion area, specifically several important access roads and the trails around them, was closed indefinitely, starting right away. The reason, Mallory clarified, was an environmental danger. According to an incident report submitted late Monday night, a private farming contractor working on nearby land that bordered the park had a major equipment malfunction during a standard pesticide application. This malfunction led to the accidental spraying of a powerful restricted chemical across the park's boundaries. The chemical, he explained, quoting the report, was hazardous if breathed in or touched before it broke down. The effects were immediate and crippling for the search operation. The contaminated area covered a large section right next to where Roisin might have gone if she had gotten confused or looked for a less busy trail. Because of the environmental risk, ground teams and K-9 units were strictly not allowed to go into the area. The danger of exposure for the searchers, Mallory stressed, referring to state and federal environmental laws, was too high. The liability for the agencies involved was huge. The decision caused instant frustration among the veteran park rangers and volunteer search organizers. They contended that they had special gear for handling dangerous materials, that the risk was justified considering the vulnerability of the missing infant, who had now been in the elements for 3 days. They begged for an exception, for a compromise that would let them search the area safely. But Detective Mallory was firm. The rules were explicit. The zone was off-limits until environmental experts could evaluate the danger and give the all-clear. This was a process that could take days, maybe even a week. In addition, Mallory highlighted the natural dangers of the deep swamp, the areas far beyond the contaminated zone. He proposed that Roisin, maybe looking for shade or becoming lost, had probably strayed much further from the main trails than anyone had first thought. He gestured toward the huge, inaccessible wilderness to the west, suggesting that was the most likely spot, given the absence of clues in the accessible parts. The search was effectively redirected. Resources were shifted to the deep swamp areas that needed airboats and special equipment, places where the odds of survival were very low. The aerial search went on over the contaminated zone, but the thick canopy of cypress and mangrove trees made thermal imaging hard and visual identification almost impossible. The most vital tool, careful ground searching, had been taken away from a crucial area of interest. The days stretched into a week. The media coverage, which had been intense at first, started to fade as the story lost momentum. The command center became quieter. The large group of volunteers got smaller. In spite of the huge effort that involved hundreds of people and thousands of hours of work, not a single sign of Roisin or Tyrion had been discovered. No diaper bag, no piece of the yellow dress, no baby carrier. It was as if they had simply vanished into the humid air. Ara Connolly wouldn't accept the story that was being formed. She knew Roisin. She wouldn't have carelessly walked into the deep swamp with her baby. The total absence of any physical clues felt wrong. It wasn't just that they hadn't located Roisin and Tyrion. It was that they hadn't located anything at all. After 2 weeks, the active search was officially reduced. The resources were required somewhere else. The dominant theory, the one written down in the reports and backed by the evaluations given during the briefings, was a tragic accident. Roisin and Tyrion had been overcome by the elements or the wildlife deep inside the Everglades. Their remains, investigators thought, were probably spread by scavengers or sunk in the murky waters, lost to the swamp forever. Ara objected, pleading with the authorities to continue searching, especially in the areas they hadn't properly checked on foot because of the contamination zone rules. But the investigation had reached a dead end. The case files were put in order, the reports were completed, and the disappearance of Roisin and Tyrion Kalin started its slow journey into the archives of unsolved cases. A year went by. The silence from the Everglades was complete. The case of Roisin and Tyrion Kalin had turned completely cold. The initial burst of action, the huge search, the media focus, it had all disappeared, leaving only a painful emptiness. For Ara Connolly, the year had been a hazy period of sorrow and anger. She never believed the official story that her daughter and grandson were simply swallowed by the swamp. She kept pushing the authorities, employed private detectives, and handed out flyers, but every clue led nowhere. The absence of any physical proof was still the main, puzzling question. The Everglades, in the meantime, carried on with its ancient cycles, unmoved by the human tragedy that had happened within its limits. But the ecosystem was in danger. An invasive species, the Burmese python, had gained a destructive presence, wiping out local animal populations. As a result, the state of Florida had approved programs that encouraged amateur hunters to find and get rid of these giant snakes, giving rewards and setting up hunts to control the population growth. It was June of 2015. Wyatt Jones and Gareth Brody, two skilled python hunters, were far into a remote grassy area of the Everglades, miles from any road or tourist path. They had been out since sunrise, making their way through the tough landscape in their modified swamp buggy, looking at the thick plants for the unique pattern of a python's skin. The area was known for big snakes, and the conditions were ideal: hot, humid, the air calm after a recent shower. The scenery spread out in front of them, a huge field of tall, dry grass that had a strange, almost pinkish-purple color under the cloudy sky. Late in the afternoon, as the light started to soften, Gareth saw it. Lying on a big, flat, gray rock, partly hidden by the tall grass, was a huge Burmese python. It was easily one of the biggest they had ever seen, probably longer than 16 feet. But it wasn't the length that first caught their eye. It was its width. The snake was coiled, lying still, its thick, strong body covered in the typical interlocking patterns of dark brown and black on a dull tan background. In the middle of its body was a massive, long bulge. The shape was very noticeable, not natural. The snake's skin was stretched tightly over the object, clearly showing it had recently eaten a very large meal. Wyatt slowed the buggy to a stop, turning off the engine. The two men watched the snake for a bit, the quiet broken only by the sound of insects. In the Everglades, A bulge that big usually meant one thing: a large deer, a pig, or maybe a big alligator. It was a major catch, both for the bounty program and for getting rid of such a large predator from the ecosystem. They acted quickly, with skill. Gareth lifted his special shotgun, loaded with heavy shot made for killing large reptiles. He fired one shot, killing the snake right away. They went up to the body. The sheer size of the snake was even more amazing up close. The bulge was enormous, solid, making the snake's body look unnaturally large. They guessed the snake with its meal weighed more than 200 pounds. It took both men a lot of effort, fighting against the dead weight, to lift the huge body onto the back of the swamp buggy. They tied it down with heavy straps and started the long, bumpy trip back to civilization. Their destination was an official FWC check-in station where the snake would be measured, weighed, and recorded as part of the python removal program. The sun was going down when they got to the station, a small building set up for processing the hunters' catches. The FWC officer on duty, a young biologist named Ben Carter, was impressed by the size of the python. He helped them move the body onto a large stainless steel table for examination. The official measurements were taken: 16 feet, 4 inches. The weight, 218 pounds. As Officer Carter wrote down the information, Wyatt and Gareth's curiosity got the best of them. It was common practice to check the stomach contents of the pythons. It gave useful information on the snake's diet and its effect on the ecosystem. Because of the size of the bulge, they were excited to see what it had eaten. They were sure it was a grown white-tailed deer. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed, lighting up the area. Wyatt picked up a big, sharp boning knife and got ready to make the cut. The mood was relaxed, the men joking about how big the antlers they might find would be. Wyatt cut through the tight skin of the snake's belly, making a long, straight cut along the bulge. The skin was thick and needed a lot of force to cut through. As the stomach area opened, the smell was instant and overpowering. The clear smell of advanced decay and the musky, sour smell of the snake's digestive juices. It was stronger than normal, more intense, but not completely surprising given the size of the meal. They pulled back the layers of skin and muscle. The stomach lining was stretched thin, almost see-through in some places. Wyatt made the last cut, opening the stomach itself. At first, the contents were hard to make out, a compressed jumble of partly digested tissue and bone. The digestive system of a python is strong, breaking down even large animals fairly quickly. Gareth reached in with heavy rubber gloves, trying to figure out what the prey was. He pulled at something large, heavy, stuck in the middle of the mass. "Must be the back of the deer," Wyatt said quietly, leaning in for a better look. Gareth had trouble with the weight, changing his grip. He pulled harder, and the object moved, coming out of the horrible mass. Then they saw it. It wasn't fur. It wasn't the skin of a deer. It was pale, smooth skin. Gareth jumped back, stumbling, his face turning white. He gagged, the smell suddenly too much to bear. Wyatt stood frozen. The knife was still in his hand, as he stared at the contents of the snake's stomach. In the bright light of the check station, a whole human leg, cut off at the hip, was exposed. The toes were visible, the skin slick and pale, but it was definitely human. The realization hit them all at once. This wasn't an animal. The python had eaten a human. The experienced hunters, who were used to the harsh realities of the wild, were deeply disturbed. The relaxed mood of the check-in station was gone. Officer Carter, seeing the object, came closer to the table. He looked into the cavity, the horror showing on his face right away. He immediately grabbed his radio, his voice strained with urgency. "Dispatch, this is Everglades Station 7. We have a situation. We need homicide detectives and the ME out here right now. We have human remains found inside a python." The check station, usually a place for routine data collection, was instantly turned into a crime scene. The area was sealed off. The investigators got there fast. The seriousness of the situation was clear in their expressions. The examination of the body continued under the guidance of the medical examiner. The process was careful and gruesome. Inside the python's digestive system, they found not only the leg, but also other large body parts, a partial torso, an arm. The remains were severely broken down by the snake's strong digestive enzymes, but they were without a doubt human, and they seemed to be from an adult. The finding was shocking, something that had never happened before, even in the Everglades, a place often linked with strange and dark events. The immediate questions were overwhelming. Who was this person? How did they end up inside a Burmese python? The first ideas were guesses. While a large python could possibly kill an adult human, it was very rare. It seemed much more probable that the snake had eaten the remains. But the remains were in pieces. Pythons don't tear their prey apart. This suggested that something else had happened to the body before the snake found it. Investigators thought about the possibility of a murder. The Everglades was a well-known place for dumping bodies. The remains were carefully gathered and taken to the medical examiner's office for study. The main goal was to identify the person. DNA testing was the only way. The DNA profile was taken from the recovered bone marrow and put into the National Missing Persons Database, CODIS. Days later, a match was found. The remains found inside the 16-foot Burmese python belonged to Roisin Kalin. The news was a huge shock to Connolly. After a year of painful not knowing, the fate of her daughter had been revealed in the most horrible way possible. The discovery confirmed Roisin's death, but it didn't bring any sense of closure. Instead, it blew the case wide open, sending the investigation into a new area of terrifying possibilities. And it brought up a crucial, painful question. Where was Tieran? The discovery of Roisin Kalin's remains inside the Burmese python re-energized the investigation. The case, which had been inactive for almost a year, was immediately reopened. It was given to a special team of detectives from the Major Crimes Unit. The horrific nature of the discovery brought back media attention and a huge amount of pressure to find answers. But the confirmation of Roisin's death only made the main mystery deeper. Crucially, inside the python, among the partly digested remains of the adult female, there were no remains, no pieces of clothing, no sign at all of 6-month-old Tieran. The investigation was up against a difficult puzzle, a horrible equation with too many unknown parts. How did Roisin die? How was her body taken apart? And what happened to the baby? The first task was to figure out the interaction between the python and the remains. The medical examiner, Dr. Evelyn Reed, did a thorough analysis of the recovered body parts. The examination confirmed what was first thought at the scene. The python had scavenged the remains. It did not kill Roisin. There were no signs of constriction trauma, no broken bones or widespread bruising that would be expected from a python attack. The dismemberment, the separation of the limbs from the torso, had happened before the snake ate the parts. This led to the main theory among the investigators, the scavenger theory. They guessed that Roisin had died in the park a year before, maybe from exposure or an accident, as was first thought. Her body, they guessed, had been taken apart by the true top predator of the Everglades, the alligator. Alligators are known to tear their prey apart, using a violent death roll, often hiding the parts underwater to decompose before eating them. The python, being an opportunistic eater, must have found these scavenged parts and eaten them. This theory seemed believable, fitting with the harsh realities of the Everglades ecosystem. It explained the dismemberment and the python's role. It gave a story that matched the initial idea that Roisin had died in the park. However, there were major inconsistencies that bothered the lead detectives. The place where the python was found was studied. It was deep inside the park, far away, but it was mostly a grassy area, not the deep water environments usually preferred by large alligators for hiding prey. Also, the damage at the points of dismemberment, though severely broken down by the python's strong digestive fluids, didn't seem to perfectly match the typical tearing action of an alligator attack. The edges of the bone, where they could be seen, seemed cleaner, more exact than would be expected from a death roll. Despite these inconsistencies, the scavenger theory was still the main idea. The alternative, that a human had taken the body apart, seemed too horrible to think about without more proof. The investigation focused on trying to find the rest of Roisin's remains and any sign of Tyrion. Search teams were sent back to the area where the python was found, doing careful grid searches, dredging nearby waterways, looking for any sign of the infant's clothing, the baby carrier, anything that might give a clue as to what happened that day. The search found nothing. The swamp stayed quiet, giving no more clues. The mystery of what happened to Tyrion became the painful focus of the investigation. If Roisin had died in an accident, Tyrion would have been with her. His remains should have been close by. The lack of any signs suggested a terrifying alternative, that someone else was involved in their disappearance, and that Tyrion had been taken from his mother. It was at this point that the investigation brought in an expert. Dr. Eris Thorne, a forensic anthropologist known for his skill in analyzing severely degraded remains and the process of decomposition, was called in to do a detailed examination of the recovered tissue. Dr. Thorne's job was to figure out the timeline of events, the environment the body had been in, and the way it was dismembered. The examination was done at the State Forensic Laboratory. The remains were carefully cleaned and gotten ready for study. Dr. Thorne spent days carefully looking at the tissue, the bone structure, and the cellular breakdown. He studied the patterns of digestion, the effects of the python's enzymes on the remains, comparing them to known samples of decomposition in the Everglades environment. He noticed that the condition of the remains, while degraded by the python, seemed inconsistent with a year of being exposed in the humid, biologically active environment of the swamp. The tissue was preserved better than expected. This observation made the scavenger theory even weaker. It was during the microscopic examination of the muscle tissue that Dr. Thorne found the anomaly. A discovery so unexpected that it would destroy the current theories and completely change the direction of the investigation. He was studying thin slices of the tissue under a high-powered microscope. Looking at the cellular structure, he saw a specific pattern of damage that was completely out of place. The cell walls were broken in a distinct way that didn't match normal decomposition, freezing temperatures in the wild, or the effects of the python's digestive fluids. He recognized the pattern right away, though he had rarely seen it in a forensic situation involving remains found in a subtropical environment. It was the sign of ice crystal formation artifacts. When biological tissue is frozen, especially when frozen quickly and kept at a consistently low temperature, the water inside the cells expands, forming sharp ice crystals that break the cell membranes. When the tissue is later thawed, the structural integrity of the cells is damaged, leaving behind these distinct microscopic marks. Dr. Thorne did more tests, taking samples from multiple places on the recovered remains. He confirmed his first observation. The cellular damage was widespread, consistent throughout the tissue. The conclusion was clear. Roisin Kalen's body had been frozen solid, probably in a commercial-grade freezer for a long time, and then thawed before being eaten by the python. The discovery was a forensic bombshell. It immediately proved the scavenger theory wrong. Roisin had not died in the Everglades a year ago and decomposed naturally. The timeline of the investigation was completely off. The implications were huge. Roisin Kalen was murdered. Her body was preserved, stored in a freezer for months, maybe almost the whole year since she disappeared. Then, relatively recently, probably just days before the python found her, her body was taken out of the freezer, taken apart, and gotten rid of in the Everglades. The discovery explained the inconsistencies in the scavenger theory, the relatively good preservation of the tissue, the clean cuts on the bone. It all pointed to human involvement. The dismemberment was not done by alligators. It was done by human hands, likely to make it easier to dispose of the body and increase the chances of it being eaten by scavengers. The python's involvement was not the main part of the crime. It was a random, strange accident that brought the crime to light. The investigation changed dramatically. This was not a tragic accident. It was a complex, calculated murder. The level of planning needed to store a body for a year suggested a perpetrator with resources, planning, and a chilling lack of empathy. The discovery also gave terrifying weight to the idea that Tyrion had been abducted. If Roisin was murdered, the perpetrator would have had to deal with the infant. The absence of Tyrion's remains suggested he might still be alive, taken by the person or persons responsible for his mother's death. The investigation now faced a new set of urgent questions. Who had the motive and the resources to commit such a horrible crime? Where was the freezer used to store Roisin's body? And most importantly, where was Tyrion? The case, once thought to be a tragic mystery of the swamp, now revealed a darkness far more calculated and sinister than anyone had imagined. The hunt for a killer and a missing child began in earnest. The revelation that Roisin Kalen's body had been frozen for nearly a year turned the investigation from a local mystery into a sprawling, complex murder case. The immediate problem was the time gap. The crime had happened a year before, but the proof had only just come out. The trail was cold, deliberately frozen by a calculating killer. The investigation focused on what was needed to commit the crime. Storing a human body for a year required a large freezer, probably a commercial-grade one, a lot of electricity, and a safe private place where the body would not be found. Investigators began the hard job of looking at energy use records for the nearby counties, looking for anything unusual that might show the presence of a large, continuously running freezer. They compared this data with records of commercial-grade freezer purchases in the months before and after Roisin's disappearance. They looked into hunting lodges, meat processing plants, and isolated properties near the Everglades. The amount of data was huge. The task was overwhelming. The analysis produced hundreds of potential leads. Each lead had to be investigated. It was a slow, careful process that involved interviews, surveillance, and background checks. Weeks turned into months. Despite the intense effort, the data did not lead to any immediate suspects. The perpetrator had successfully hidden their crime in plain sight, leaving no clear trace of the storage location. The investigation stalled again. The initial shock of the python discovery and the forensic breakthrough faded, and the case began to move back toward the cold case files. The complexity of the crime and the lack of physical proof from the original crime scene made it almost impossible to make progress. It was in 2016, almost 2 years after Roshin's disappearance, that a new perspective was brought to the case. Detective Elena Ruiz, a careful investigator from the cold case unit, began a thorough review of the entire case file. Ruiz was motivated by the proof that the initial investigation in 2014 was flawed, maybe critically so. The freezing evidence showed that the main theory at the time, that Roshin died in the swamp, was wrong. Ruiz decided to re-examine the initial search effort from the beginning, looking for anything unusual, missed opportunities, or anything that might explain how the crime scene, wherever it was missed or ignored. Ruiz spent weeks deep in the 2014 files. She studied the search coordination logs, the deployment maps, the witness statements, the communication records from the command center. She focused on the decisions made during the crucial first days of the search, the time when the trail was freshest. It was during this review that she came across the contamination zone. The reports described the closure of a large section of the park because of an accidental pesticide spill. The closure had sent ground teams away from key areas near Roshin's last known location. At the time, it was seen as an unfortunate problem, a bureaucratic obstacle that slowed down the search effort. But with the new evidence that Roshin was murdered and her body stored, the timing and location of the spill seemed suspiciously convenient. It had effectively stopped the search in a critical area during the most crucial time of the investigation. Ruiz decided to check the incident report for the chemical spill. It was a routine check, a matter of being thorough. She started by contacting the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, asking for records of the reported pesticide overspray in June of 2014. A spill of a restricted pesticide would create a significant paper trail involving required reporting and cleanup procedures. The EPA did a complete search of their database. Their answer was surprising. There was no record of any such incident in the Everglades or the nearby areas during that time. Confused, Ruiz contacted the state agricultural agencies, the regulatory bodies in charge of pesticide use in Florida. They also found no record of a spill. She then tried to contact the private agricultural contractor named in the police report as being responsible for the overspray. She found out that the company did not exist. The conclusion was chilling and undeniable. The chemical spill was completely made up. The contamination zone was a lie. A ghost story created to block the search for Roshin and Tiran. The implications were huge. It meant that someone with authority, someone inside the investigation, had intentionally sabotaged the search from the start. The focus immediately moved to the officer who approved the closure of the zone, Detective Jasper Mallory. Mallory, the police liaison during the initial search, was the one who reported the spill and enforced the closure. He had actively steered the investigation away from the restricted area, pushing the theory that Roshin had wandered deep into the swamp. He had been the architect of the misdirection. Detective Ruiz showed her findings to Internal Affairs. The realization that a police officer might be involved in covering up a murder and kidnapping was explosive. Mallory was immediately put under investigation. A deep financial audit was started. Investigators began discreetly watching Mallory's activities, analyzing his communications, his movements, his behavior. They needed to understand how far the corruption went, and more importantly, who Mallory was working for. Mallory, a veteran detective with years of experience reading the signs of an investigation, felt the scrutiny, the sudden coldness from his colleagues, the restricted access to case files, the feeling of being watched. He knew that the lie about the chemical spill was being discovered. The realization caused a desperate, panicked reaction. Late one night, long after the precinct had emptied, Mallory made a critical mistake. He used his authorization code to get into the department's archival server room. The room, located in the basement of the headquarters, held the physical servers containing the digital records of past investigations, including the detailed coordination logs and communications from the 2014 search. Mallory thought he could physically destroy the servers, erasing the digital trail of his actions, the records of the made-up spill, the communications authorizing the closure. If the data was gone, the evidence against him would be circumstantial. He entered the climate-controlled room, the air cold, the silence broken only by the whirring of the cooling fans and the hum of the servers. He found the specific server rack containing the 2014 data. He began the process of taking apart the hardware, trying to forcibly remove the hard drives. The metal casing resisted his efforts. His hands slick with sweat, he pulled harder, the sound of wrenching metal echoing in the quiet room. He didn't know that internal affairs investigators, expecting such a move, had put the server room under surveillance. They were watching him on the security cameras, recording his desperate attempt to destroy evidence. As Mallory struggled with the server rack, the hard drive finally coming loose in his hand, the door burst open. Internal affairs investigators flooded the room, their weapons drawn, the beams of their flashlights cutting through the dim light. "Detective Mallory, step away from the server!" Mallory spun around, his face pale with shock and fear, the hard drive clattering to the floor. He was caught in the act, the dismantled server components scattered at his feet. The confrontation was tense, brief. Mallory, cornered and exposed, offered no resistance. He was arrested, suspended from duty, and the investigation escalated from an internal review to a criminal probe. The exposure of the fabricated chemical spill and Mallory's desperate attempt to destroy the evidence confirmed the existence of a conspiracy. The investigation now had a clear target. But the question remained: who was pulling the strings? Who had the power and the motive to corrupt a seasoned police detective and orchestrate such an elaborate cover-up? The arrest of Detective Jasper Mallory sent shockwaves through the department and the local community. The evidence of his corruption was undeniable, but his motivation remained the central question. Fabricating a chemical spill to obstruct a missing person investigation, particularly one involving an infant, was an extreme act. It suggested a powerful outside influence, someone willing to pay a high price to keep the truth hidden. The investigation centered on the financial audit of Mallory's accounts. The internal affairs investigators, now collaborating with forensic accountants from the state attorney's office, delved deep into Mallory's finances. The audit uncovered a series of large cash deposits that began the day after Roisin Kalin disappeared in June of 2014. The deposits were irregular, structured to avoid triggering mandatory reporting, and completely out of line with Mallory's salary. The total amount was over $150,000 over the 2 years since the disappearance. The cash deposits were hard to trace, but the forensic accountants started the painstaking process of analyzing Mallory's financial activities, searching for connections, patterns, or anything that might reveal the source of the money. They tracked the complex money laundering scheme Mallory had used to hide the funds, funneling the cash through a series of intermediaries, small businesses, and shell accounts. It was a sophisticated operation, suggesting Mallory had help in concealing the money. After months of intensive forensic accounting, following the trail through a maze of transactions, they finally traced the origin of the funds back to a shell corporation registered in Delaware. The corporation, named Osprey Holdings Group, had no apparent business activities. Its sole purpose seemed to be to obscure the movement of money. The investigation then shifted to identifying the individuals behind Osprey Holdings Group. The ownership structure was unclear, concealed behind layers of legal barriers. But the investigators persisted, using subpoenas and court orders to force the disclosure of the corporate records. The trail led them to a name that was associated with power and influence in South Florida: Orion Vance. Orion Vance was a wealthy, politically connected real estate developer. He was known for his vast land holdings adjacent to the Everglades, his extravagant lifestyle, and his ruthless business methods. He was a major political contributor, with his influence reaching deep into local government. He was also known for his passion for alligator hunting, often arranging private hunts on his extensive properties and within the accessible parts of the Everglades. The link between Orion Vance and the disappearance of Roisin Kalin was not immediately clear. Vance moved in circles far from Roisin's life as a part-time nurse. But the financial connection to Mallory was undeniable. The investigation now had a primary suspect, a powerful adversary who had the resources and the influence to orchestrate the cover-up. But they needed more than just a money trail. They needed evidence linking Vance directly to the crime. Investigators began a discreet probe into Orion Vance and his family, including his son, Cameron Vance, who was 18 at the time of Roisin's disappearance. They analyzed their movements in June of 2014, their activities, their connections. But the Vances were protected by their wealth and influence. Their properties were secure, their activities private. The investigation faced a formidable challenge. As the corruption investigation continued, focusing intensely on the Vance family, an unrelated breakthrough occurred thousands of miles away, a development that would unexpectedly connect with the Kalin case and break it wide open. It was early 2017. Interpol, in coordination with local authorities in Eastern Europe, conducted a series of raids on a high-end human trafficking ring operating out of Moldova. The ring specialized in illegal adoptions, acquiring infants and young children for wealthy clients around the world. They provided a complete service, from obtaining the child to creating fraudulent documents and transporting them across international borders. The raids were the result of a long-term investigation into the activities of Gregor Hijov, the elusive and ruthless head of the organization. During the raid on Hijov's headquarters, a heavily fortified compound, authorities captured Hijov and seized encrypted servers containing the organization's records, client lists, financial transactions, and communication logs. The data was vast, complex, and protected by sophisticated encryption. Interpol's cybercrime unit began the laborious process of decrypting and analyzing the seized data. It was during this analysis, deep within the encrypted files, that they discovered a record that immediately caught their attention. The record detailed the smuggling of an American infant from Florida in late June of 2014. The infant, described as a male approximately 6 months old, matched the description of Tyran Kalin. The transaction was classified as a priority extraction, commissioned by a high-paying anonymous client. The details of the transportation, the fraudulent documents, and the final destination were meticulously recorded. The discovery was immediately flagged and passed on to U.S. authorities. The timing and location were too specific to be a coincidence. The possibility that Tyran Kalin had been trafficked overseas electrified the investigation in Florida. Detective Ruiz and her team compared the timing of the smuggling operation with the financial data from the Vance investigation. They focused on the Shell Corporation, Osprey Holdings Group, controlled by Orion Vance. They discovered a massive wire transfer of several $100,000 from Osprey Holdings Group to an offshore account linked to Gregor Yichov's organization. The transfer occurred during the same week the baby was reportedly smuggled from Florida. The convergence of the two investigations was staggering. The connection between Roisin's murder, the corruption of Detective Mallory, and the international human trafficking ring was solidified. The evidence painted a chilling picture. Orion Vance had orchestrated the cover-up of Roisin's death and the trafficking of her infant son. The realization that Tyrion might still be alive, now 3 years old, living somewhere in Eastern Europe, injected a new, desperate urgency into the investigation. The focus shifted from simply proving the murder to rescuing the child. The investigation now had the evidence needed to confront the perpetrators. The time had come to dismantle the conspiracy and bring the truth to light. The evidence linking Orion Vance to Roisin Kaelin's murder and Tyrion Kaelin's abduction was overwhelming. The financial trail connecting Vance to the corrupt detective Jasper Mallory and the international human trafficker Gregor Yicov provided the leverage needed to unravel the conspiracy. The investigation proceeded swiftly. The priority now was the rescue of Tyrion. The first target was Detective Mallory. He was already in custody, facing charges of obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and corruption. Now, armed with the irrefutable evidence of the bribery, the fabricated chemical spill, and the connection to the human trafficking ring, investigators confronted Mallory with the full weight of the case. They presented him with the Interpol data, the wire transfers, the undeniable proof that his actions had facilitated not just a cover-up, but the trafficking of a child. The interrogation was intense. Mallory, facing the prospect of federal charges related to human trafficking and potentially being an accessory to murder, realized the gravity of his situation. The years of deception, the weight of his complicity, finally broke him. The prosecutors offered him a narrow window for cooperation. Mallory confessed. He admitted that Orion Vance had paid him to fabricate the chemical spill story. The purpose was to keep searchers away from a specific area of the Everglades, a remote access road near the Vance family's extensive landholdings where the crime had taken place. Mallory claimed he didn't know the full details of the crime at the time, only that Vance needed the area secured and the investigation steered away from his family. He provided the details of their arrangement, the communication methods, the payment schedule. He gave them everything they needed to move against the Vances. Mallory's confession provided the final piece of the puzzle, the direct testimony needed to secure search warrants for the Vance estate. The operation was planned meticulously. The Vance estate was a sprawling, heavily secured compound bordering the Everglades. The risk of confrontation or the destruction of evidence was high. The Vances were wealthy, armed, and desperate. A coordinated, high-stakes SWAT operation was authorized. The target was the arrest of Orion Vance and his son, Cameron Vance, now 21 years old. The operation involved federal agents, state police, and the local SWAT team. At dawn, the operation began. A convoy of armored vehicles, supported by helicopters overhead, descended on the Vance estate. They breached the gates and secured the perimeter, moving rapidly toward the main villa. The silence of the early morning was shattered by the roar of engines, the chopping of helicopter blades, and the shouts of the SWAT team. The team assigned to the main villa moved quickly, breaching the entrance with a controlled explosion and fanning out through the opulent rooms. The interior was vast, a maze of corridors and luxurious furnishings. They found Orion Vance in his study, seemingly preparing for his day, oblivious to the impending raid. He was arrested without incident, his demeanor cold, arrogant, and defiant, even as the handcuffs were secured around his wrists. Simultaneously, another team moved to secure Cameron Vance. He was in the guest house, a smaller residence located several hundred yards from the main villa. But as the police vehicles approached, Cameron heard the commotion. He looked out the window, saw the flashing lights and the armored vehicles converging on the estate. Panic seized him. Cameron bolted from the guest house, jumping into a high-powered off-road vehicle parked nearby. He gunned the engine and tore across the expansive property, heading toward the dense wilderness of the Everglades bordering the estate. He knew the terrain intimately, having hunted there since childhood. The chase was immediate and tense. The SWAT team pursued Cameron in their vehicles, the off-road terrain making the chase difficult and dangerous. Cameron drove recklessly, weaving through the trees, attempting to reach the inaccessible areas of the swamp where he believed he could escape. The helicopter monitoring the operation tracked his movements, its thermal imaging camera locked on the heat signature of the vehicle, relaying his position to the pursuing ground teams. The chase spanned several miles of the Vance property, a high-speed pursuit through the rugged landscape. Cameron pushed the vehicle to its limits, but the coordinated effort of the ground teams and air support was too much. They managed to corner him, cutting off his escape route near a deep canal. Cameron, realizing he was trapped, abandoned the vehicle and attempted to flee on foot, scrambling into the dense undergrowth. He was apprehended after a brief struggle, his face pale with fear, the realization of his situation finally sinking in. With both Orion and Cameron Vance in custody, the investigation focused on searching the estate. The priority was to locate evidence of the murder, specifically the freezer used to store Roisin Kalen's body. The estate was vast, with multiple buildings, storage facilities, and hunting lodges. The search was meticulous and systematic. Crime scene investigators, armed with the knowledge of the freezing evidence, focused on areas capable of housing a large freezer. It was in the basement of the main villa that they found it. Concealed behind a false wall in a large storage area was a commercial-grade walk-in freezer. It was the kind used in restaurants or for storing large quantities of game meat. It was running, the temperature inside well below freezing. The freezer was empty, recently cleaned, the surfaces scrubbed spotless, the air inside smelling faintly of bleach. But the forensic teams knew that cleaning a freezer used to store a human body for a year would not erase all traces of evidence. They began the meticulous process of forensic analysis. They used luminol, a chemical that reacts with iron in hemoglobin, causing it to glow blue in the dark. They sprayed the interior of the freezer. The surfaces glowed faintly, indicating the presence of blood that had been cleaned. But the critical evidence came from hidden areas, places where cleaning would be difficult, the microscopic crevices where biological material could accumulate. Investigators focused on the rubber seals around the freezer door, the intricate grooves where fluids could seep and become trapped. They dismantled the drainage system, the pipes where condensation and fluids would collect. The forensic teams collected samples, conducting preliminary tests on site. The results were positive. They found trace evidence of Roisin Kalen's blood and DNA preserved within the seals and drainage system of the freezer. The discovery was the final, irrefutable proof. The freezer confirmed where Roisin's body had been stored for a year, linking the Vances directly to the murder and the elaborate cover-up. The chain of evidence was complete. Orion and Cameron Vance were interrogated separately at the Federal Detention Center. The weight of the evidence against them, the financial records linking them to Mallory and Ichov. Mallory's confession, the DNA evidence recovered from the freezer, was insurmountable. Under the intense pressure of interrogation, Cameron Vance broke down. The fear and guilt, suppressed for nearly 3 years, finally surfaced. He confessed to his role in the crime, the details spilling out in a torrent of panicked words. Cameron admitted that on June 14, 2014, he was driving his truck on a service access road in the Everglades. He was 18 years old, intoxicated, and illegally hunting alligators. He was driving recklessly, speeding down the narrow road, when he rounded a bend and struck Roisin Kaelin. The impact was sudden and brutal. Roisin was thrown to the ground, knocked unconscious, bleeding profusely from a head wound. Cameron stopped the truck, panicking. He saw Roisin lying on the road, the baby strapped to her chest. Miraculously, Roisin had shielded Tieran during the fall. The infant was unharmed, crying but alive. Cameron, drunk and terrified of the consequences, a potential DUI manslaughter charge that would destroy his future, called his father. Orion Vance arrived at the scene quickly. He assessed the situation with cold calculation. He saw his intoxicated son, the injured woman, the crying baby. In a ruthless decision to protect his son and his family's reputation, Orion took control. Instead of calling for help, Orion loaded the unconscious Roisin and the crying Tieran into his truck. He drove them back to the estate. There, in the secluded basement of the main villa, Orion murdered the injured Roisin, ensuring her silence. He then placed her body in the commercial-grade walk-in freezer, preserving it while he orchestrated the cover-up. He immediately contacted Detective Mallory, using his influence and promising a substantial payment to fabricate the chemical spill, keeping the search away from the accident site. The baby, Tieran, presented a different problem. Orion couldn't kill the infant, but he couldn't keep him either. He used his connections in the criminal underworld to contact Gregor Ijov's organization. He arranged for Tieran to be handed over to the human trafficking ring a few weeks later, paying a substantial fee for the illicit adoption and the guarantee that the child would disappear without a trace. Roisin's body remained in the freezer for a year. When the case went cold and public attention faded, Orion decided to dispose of the body. He removed it from the freezer, dismembered it to facilitate disposal, and dumped the parts deep in the Everglades, hoping scavengers would erase the evidence of his crime. He never anticipated that a Burmese python would consume the remains and reveal the truth. The confessions were detailed and chilling. The crime was not premeditated murder, but a series of calculated, ruthless decisions driven by a desperate attempt to protect wealth and privilege. With the confession secured and the evidence compiled, the focus shifted to the rescue of Tieran Kaelin. Utilizing the information from the seized servers and the Vance's confessions, Interpol tracked the smuggling route. They identified the adoptive family in Eastern Europe. The family, unaware of the horrific circumstances of the adoption, had been deceived by Ijov's organization. The process was delicate and complex, involving international diplomacy and legal negotiations. Finally, after weeks of coordination, authorities located Tieran, now 3 years old. He was healthy, safe, and unaware of his tragic past. Ara Connolly immediately traveled to Eastern Europe. The journey was a blur of anxiety and hope. After nearly 3 years of agonizing grief, she was finally going to see her grandson. The reunion took place at a government facility. Ara waited in a quiet room, her heart pounding. The door opened, and a social worker walked in, holding the hand of a small boy. The moment Ara saw Tieran, The resemblance to Roisin was unmistakable. The years of grief, the weight of the loss, finally lifted. She knelt down, tears streaming down her face, and opened her arms. Orion and Cameron Vance were charged with murder, kidnapping, human trafficking, and obstruction of justice. They both received lengthy prison sentences, their wealth and influence unable to shield them from the consequences of their crimes. Jasper Mallory was convicted for his role in the conspiracy and imprisoned. Ara Connolly gained full custody of Tyrion, returning to Florida to begin a new life, honoring Roisin's memory by providing Tyrion with the love and security his mother had fought so hard to give him.